The road that led to the scorpion venom production facility stretched like a pale scar across the dry, wind-brushed plains, and as I drove closer, the landscape seemed to grow quieter, as if even the insects understood the strange purpose of the place ahead. The building itself rose low and angular against the horizon, all reinforced glass and sand-colored concrete, designed less to impress and more to endure, and yet there was something quietly intimidating about its presence, as though it held secrets that demanded respect rather than curiosity. I had signed the contract only a week earlier, lured by the promise of high pay and the vague thrill of working somewhere most people would never dare to enter. But now, as I stepped out of the car and felt the heat cling to my skin, I wondered if curiosity alone had been enough of a reason. A security gate slid open with a mechanical hum after scanning my ID, and I walked through, each step echoing faintly against the sterile flooring inside the reception area, where the air was cool and faintly antiseptic. A woman in a crisp uniform greeted me without smiling, her eyes sharp and assessing, as if measuring not just my identity but my resolve, and she handed me a badge along with a brief set of instructions that felt more like a warning than a welcome. I was told to follow the marked corridors, to never remove my protective gloves inside designated zones. And above all, to remain calm no matter what I encountered, a phrase that lingered in my mind longer than it should have. The hallway beyond reception was lined with thick glass panels, and behind them I caught my first glimpses of the facility's true purpose, rows upon rows of enclosures, each containing scorpions of varying sizes and shades, their bodies glinting under controlled lighting, their tails curled like loaded springs. There was an unsettling beauty to them, a precision in their stillness that made every slight movement feel deliberate and meaningful, and I found myself slowing my pace just to watch them, drawn in despite the instinctive tension coiling in my chest. A man in a lab coat intercepted me halfway down the corridor, introducing himself as Dr. Holden, the supervisor assigned to oversee my training, and his handshake was firm but brief, his attention already shifting toward the work awaiting us. He spoke quickly, efficiently, explaining that the venom extracted here was among the most valuable biological substances in the world, used in medical research, pharmaceuticals, and experimental treatments that could change lives, and that each drop required precision, patience, and a tolerance for risk that not everyone possessed. As he led me deeper into the facility, the hum of machinery grew more pronounced, blending with the faint, almost imperceptible sounds of the scorpions themselves. A subtle rustling that seemed to follow us from room to room. We stopped before a reinforced door marked with warning symbols, and Dr. Holden turned to me with a look that was almost amused, as if he had seen this moment play out many times before, the point where anticipation and doubt collided. He asked if I was ready, and although I hesitated for just a fraction of a second, I nodded, because turning back now would have meant admitting that the unknown held more power over me than I was willing to accept. The door slid open with a soft hiss, revealing a brightly lit chamber filled with workstations, specialized tools, and more scorpions than I had ever imagined could exist in one place. And as I stepped inside, I realized that this was not just a job or a curiosity, but an immersion into a world where danger and purpose were inseparably intertwined, and where every action carried weight, every movement required intention, and every mistake could come at a cost far greater than I had yet begun to understand. The first thing that struck me inside the extraction chamber was the precision of everything, the way each workstation was arranged with almost obsessive care, as if even the smallest deviation could ripple outward into consequences no one wanted to face, and as I stood there absorbing it all, I became acutely aware of my own inexperience. Dr. Holden guided me toward an empty station, his movements practiced and economical, and he began explaining the process in greater detail, though his tone suggested that explanation alone would never be enough to prepare me for what I was about to do. He showed me the tools, the fine-tipped forceps, the collection vials, the stimulation device used to encourage venom release. And each item seemed deceptively simple until I considered what it would be used for. Across the room, other technicians were already at work, their gloved hands steady as they handled the scorpions with a calm that bordered on indifference, yet there was nothing careless in their movements, only a controlled confidence that came from repetition and respect. I watched as one technician carefully grasped a scorpion by the base of its tail, positioning it under a small electrode, and with a subtle application of current, a droplet of venom formed at the tip of the stinger, clear and almost delicate in appearance, before being collected into a vial with meticulous precision. The entire process took less than a minute. Yet it felt like a performance, each step deliberate and essential, and I realized that what I was witnessing was not just technique but discipline. Doctor. Holden handed me a pair of gloves and instructed me to put them on, reminding me that they were resistant but not invincible, a detail that settled uneasily in my mind. He selected a scorpion from a nearby enclosure, its body a deep amber hue, its pincers slightly raised as if already anticipating the interaction, and he placed it gently on the workstation in front of me. My pulse quickened as I leaned closer, the creature's movement subtle but unmistakably alert, its tail arched in a posture that seemed both defensive and poised for action. Control comes from understanding, Doctor. Holden said, his voice steady, not from force, and he demonstrated the proper grip once more, his fingers firm yet careful as he immobilized the tail without provoking unnecessary agitation. Then he stepped back, giving me space, and for a moment, the room seemed to narrow to just the scorpion and my own hesitation. I reached forward, my hand slower than I intended, and as my fingers closed around the tail, I felt a strange mixture of fear and focus, as though my instincts were at odds with the task I had chosen. The scorpion reacted instantly, its body tensing, its pincers opening wider, and for a fraction of a second, I thought I might lose control. But I tightened my grip just enough to steady it without crushing it. Doctor. Holden nodded, a small acknowledgement that felt more significant than any verbal praise, and guided me through the next steps, positioning the stinger near the electrode, instructing me to apply the current with precision. When the venom appeared, it was almost underwhelming in its physical presence, a tiny droplet that belied its potency, yet I found myself staring at it with a kind of awe, aware that this substance carried both danger and possibility in equal measure. As I collected it into the vial, my hands steadier now, I felt something shift within me, a realization that this work demanded not just technical skill but a willingness to engage with fear without letting it dictate my actions. Around me, the chamber continued its quiet, methodical rhythm, each technician focused on their task, each scorpion a reminder of the delicate balance we were maintaining, and as I placed the vial into its holder, I understood that this was only the beginning, that the deeper I went into this world, the more it would test not just my abilities, but my understanding of control, risk, and the thin line that separated them. By the third hour inside the extraction chamber, the initial surge of adrenaline had settled into something quieter but more persistent, a low, steady awareness that never quite faded, and as I moved from one workstation task to the next, I began to notice the subtleties that had been invisible to me before. The scorpions were not identical in temperament, and even within the same species, there were differences that mattered, slight variations in posture, responsiveness, and timing that could determine whether an extraction went smoothly or turned into a tense struggle for control. Dr. Holden observed me from a short distance, intervening only when necessary, allowing me to make small mistakes that carried lessons but not consequences. And I sensed that this was deliberate, a way of teaching that relied on experience rather than instruction alone. At one point, he brought over a different specimen, darker, larger, its exoskeleton almost matte under the overhead lights, and he told me that this species required a more careful approach, not because it was more aggressive, but because it reacted unpredictably to stimulation. As I prepared my tools, I felt a flicker of unease return, sharper than before, and I realized that familiarity had not diminished the risk, it had simply changed my perception of it. The scorpion moved more slowly than the others I had handled, its tail making small, measured adjustments, as if it were studying me in return. And when I reached to secure it, there was a moment where neither of us committed, a brief standoff that seemed to stretch longer than it should have. When I finally took hold, the movement had to be precise, and I could feel the tension in my own hand mirrored in the rigidity of the creature's body. The electrode made contact, and for a second, nothing happened, which was enough to make me question whether I had done it correctly, but then the tail twitched sharply, and the venom appeared more suddenly than I expected, a slightly larger droplet that clung to the stinger before I quickly collected it. "Good, Doctor," Holden said, his voice carrying a note of approval that was still measured, but more distinct than before, and I allowed myself a brief exhale, aware that I had been holding my breath without realizing it. As the day progressed, the rhythm of the work became more ingrained, yet it never became routine, each extraction demanding attention, each scorpion presenting a new set of variables that prevented complacency from taking hold. During a short break, I stepped into an adjacent observation room where the enclosures stretched in long, orderly rows, and without the immediate pressure of handling them, I found myself looking at the scorpions differently, less as tasks and more as living systems, each one adapted perfectly to its environment, each one carrying within it a substance that we were only beginning to understand. Dr. Holden joined me there, leaning lightly against the glass, and he spoke about the broader implications of the work, how certain compounds in the venom showed promise in targeting cancer cells, how others could be used in neurological research, and how the facility's output, though small in volume, had a disproportionate impact on scientific progress. There was a quiet intensity in the way he spoke, a conviction that went beyond professional obligation, and it made me reconsider the nature of what we were doing, not just extracting venom, but participating in something that extended far beyond these walls. When we returned to the chamber, the work resumed with the same steady cadence. But my perspective had shifted, and with it came a deeper sense of responsibility, because now the risk was not just personal, it was tied to the value of what we were producing, and the realization that every drop carried weight not only in terms of danger, but in its potential to alter outcomes far beyond this controlled, carefully maintained environment. By late afternoon, fatigue began to reveal itself in subtle ways, not as a dramatic loss of focus but as a slight delay between intention and action, a fraction of a second that could easily go unnoticed unless you were trained to look for it, and here, that fraction mattered. Dr. Holden seemed to notice it before I did, his gaze sharpening as he observed my movements, and he called for a brief pause, not as a suggestion but as a necessity, emphasizing that endurance in this line of work was not about pushing through exhaustion but recognizing its early signs. We stepped into a quieter section of the facility, a monitoring room filled with screens displaying temperature, humidity, and activity levels across the enclosures, and the steady stream of data felt oddly calming after the intensity of direct handling. He explained that the scorpions were highly sensitive to environmental fluctuations, that even minor changes could influence their behavior and venom yield, and that maintaining consistency was as critical as the extraction itself. As he spoke, one of the alerts on the panel flickered briefly, a small deviation in one of the habitat zones, and without hesitation, he moved to address it, adjusting controls with practiced precision until the reading stabilized again. There was something reassuring in that responsiveness, a sense that nothing here was left unattended for long. Yet it also reinforced how dependent the entire operation was on constant vigilance. When we returned to the extraction chamber, the atmosphere felt subtly different, not because anything had changed physically, but because I was now more aware of the system as a whole, the interconnected processes that made each successful extraction possible. I resumed work with renewed focus, but the fatigue lingered at the edges, testing my consistency, and it was during one of these moments that I nearly made my first serious mistake. The scorpion I was handling was smaller than the others, its movements quick and erratic, and as I reached to secure its tail, my grip was just slightly off. Not enough to lose control entirely, but enough for the stinger to flick closer to my glove than I was comfortable with. The reaction was immediate, my heart rate spiking as I corrected my hold, tightening my grip just enough to regain stability without causing harm, and for a brief instant, the room seemed to narrow again, all peripheral awareness collapsing into that single point of contact. Doctor. Holden was beside me almost instantly, not intervening physically, but close enough to act if necessary, his presence steadying rather than intrusive, and I managed to complete the extraction without further issue. When it was done, I released the scorpion back into its container, my movements more deliberate now. And only then did I allow myself to fully register how close I had come to losing control. That, he said quietly, is where most people decide whether they belong here or not, and there was no judgment in his tone, only an acknowledgement of the reality we were operating within. I nodded, not trusting myself to respond immediately, because the experience had left a lingering tension that words would not easily resolve. As the shift neared its end, the pace of work slowed slightly, allowing for equipment checks and documentation, and I found a certain clarity returning as the immediate pressure eased, though the memory of that near miss remained vivid. It wasn't just a warning. It was a recalibration, a reminder that no amount of early success could substitute for sustained attention, and as I removed my gloves and prepared to leave the chamber, I understood that this environment would not forgive complacency, that it demanded a level of awareness that had to be maintained continuously, not just in moments of obvious risk. Walking back through the corridor lined with enclosures, I paused again, watching the scorpions in their controlled habitats, and for the first time, I felt not just fascination or unease, but a kind of respect that bordered on caution, because now I knew how little it took for control to slip, and how much depended on never letting that happen. The following morning began earlier than I expected, the desert air still carrying a trace of coolness as I approached the facility again, but whatever calm the outside world offered seemed to dissolve the moment I stepped back through the security gate and into the controlled environment within. There was a different energy in the building at that hour, quieter, more deliberate, as if the day had not yet fully unfolded, and I found that I preferred it, the reduced noise making it easier to focus on the details that had started to define my experience here. Dr. Holden was already inside the extraction chamber when I arrived, reviewing logs on a tablet, and he acknowledged me with a brief nod before handing me a set of updated assignments. explaining that today I would rotate through several stations to broaden my exposure to different species and techniques. The idea of variety was both intriguing and unsettling, because while I had begun to develop a sense of rhythm with the previous day's work, I knew that each new variable would challenge that fragile confidence. The first station introduced me to a species that was noticeably more reactive, its movements sharp and defensive even within the enclosure, and the technician overseeing that section, a woman named Elira, demonstrated a slightly altered handling method that emphasized speed without sacrificing control. Watching her work was like observing a different style of the same discipline. Her motions quicker but no less precise, and when it was my turn, I had to adjust not just my technique, but my mindset, committing to actions more decisively than before. The scorpion responded immediately to hesitation, its tail snapping into position with alarming speed, and I realized that with this species, doubt translated directly into risk, forcing me to act with a level of confidence that had to be genuine, not forced. After several attempts, my movements began to align more closely with what was required, and although the tension never fully disappeared, it became more manageable, a constant presence rather than an overwhelming one. Later in the rotation, I was introduced to a station focused on processing and cataloging the collected venom. A stark contrast to the physical intensity of extraction, yet no less critical in its own way. Here, the emphasis shifted to accuracy and traceability, each vial labeled, measured, and stored according to strict protocols that ensured its viability for research and application. The technician in charge explained how even minor errors in documentation could compromise entire batches, rendering the work of multiple extractions useless, and it reinforced the idea that every stage of the process was interconnected, each relying on the integrity of the others. As I worked through the tasks, carefully transferring measured quantities into secure storage units, I found a different kind of focus emerging. One that required patience and attention to detail rather than immediate physical control. By midday, the rotations had taken me through enough variations to feel both more capable and more aware of my limitations, a dual realization that kept me grounded in a way that unchecked confidence never could. When I returned to the main extraction area for the final segment of the shift, I noticed that my approach had subtly changed, my movements more deliberate, my awareness broader, as if the experiences from each station had begun to integrate into a more cohesive understanding of the work. Dr. Holden observed this without comment for a while, allowing me to continue, and when he finally spoke, it was to point out a small adjustment in my grip that improved stability without increasing pressure, a refinement so slight that I might not have noticed it on my own. It was in these details that progress revealed itself, not in dramatic breakthroughs, but in incremental improvements that accumulated over time. As the day drew to a close, I felt a deeper sense of immersion than before, less like a visitor navigating unfamiliar territory and more like a participant beginning to understand the underlying structure of the environment. Yet alongside that growing familiarity was a quiet awareness that I was still at the beginning, that the facility had layers I had not yet seen, processes I had not yet encountered, and risks I had not yet fully appreciated, and as I left the building, the fading light stretching long shadows across the ground, I carried with me not just the memory of the day's work, but the sense that each step forward here revealed new complexities rather than simplifying the path ahead. By the end of my first week, the facility no longer felt like a foreign environment, but it also hadn't become comfortable in the way ordinary workplaces might. Instead, it existed in a state of constant, controlled tension that I had begun to accept as normal, and perhaps even necessary. That morning, Dr. Holden informed me that I would be introduced to the containment wing, a section of the facility I had only glimpsed in passing, and his tone carried a weight that suggested this was not just another routine expansion of my duties. The corridor leading there was narrower, the lighting slightly dimmer, and the security protocols noticeably stricter, requiring multiple clearances before the final door would open. Each step reinforcing the sense that what lay beyond demanded a higher level of caution. When we entered, the difference was immediate, the enclosures larger, more reinforced, housing species that were not only more potent in their venom but also less predictable in their behavior, and I felt a familiar tension return, sharper than it had been in days. Dr. Holden explained that this wing was reserved for high-value extractions, where even a single successful collection could justify the increased risk, and that only the most experienced technicians worked here regularly. Today, I would not be extracting alone, but assisting, observing, and learning under direct supervision, a boundary that I was both relieved and slightly frustrated to accept. The technician assigned to the demonstration was a man named Corbin, whose movements carried an economy and confidence that immediately set him apart, and as he prepared his station, there was a quiet focus about him that seemed to narrow the entire room to the task at hand. The scorpion he selected was unlike any I had handled before, its body darker, almost black, its tail thicker, the stinger more pronounced, and even within the enclosure, it exuded a presence that felt more deliberate, more aware. Corbin spoke very little, explaining only the essentials, emphasizing that with this species, anticipation was as important as reaction, and that reading its behavior was the key to maintaining control. As he reached in, his movements were slower than I expected, not out of hesitation, but precision, each adjustment calculated to avoid triggering a defensive strike, and when he secured the tail, it was done with such exactness that the scorpion's reaction was minimal, controlled before it could escalate. The extraction itself required a modified approach, the stimulation calibrated differently, the positioning more exact, and when the venom appeared, it was in a slightly larger quantity, its clarity almost deceptive given its potency. Watching him work, I realized that what separated technicians at this level was not just skill, but an ability to remain completely composed under pressure. To operate without wasted motion or unnecessary force, and it set a standard that felt both inspiring and distant. After the demonstration, Corbin allowed me to assist with a secondary extraction, guiding my hands more directly than Dr. Holden had in previous sessions, correcting my positioning in real time, and although I was not fully in control of the process, the proximity to it was enough to sharpen my awareness to a new degree. At one point, the scorpion reacted more abruptly than anticipated, its tail jerking with sudden force, and for a split second, the situation teetered on the edge of instability, but Corbin adjusted instantly, compensating with a subtle shift that brought everything back under control before it could escalate. The moment passed quickly, but its intensity lingered, a reminder that at this level, the margin for error was even thinner, the consequences more immediate. When we stepped away from the station, I felt a mix of exhilaration and humility, aware that I had witnessed a level of mastery that would take time to approach, and that the path there would not be straightforward. Dr. Holden seemed to sense this, and as we left the containment wing, he spoke quietly about progression, about how exposure to higher-risk environments was as much about understanding one's limits as it was about expanding them. The rest of the day felt almost subdued by comparison, the standard extraction work familiar yet subtly reframed by what I had seen. And as I moved through it, I found myself paying closer attention to the smallest details, aware that each refinement brought me incrementally closer to that level of control. By the time I left the facility that evening, the experience of the containment wing had settled into something more reflective, less immediate but more significant, and I understood that while I had taken another step forward, the distance to true mastery remained considerable, defined not by dramatic leaps, but by the accumulation of precise, disciplined actions over time. The incident happened without warning, which in retrospect was exactly what made it so instructive, because up until that moment, every challenge I had faced inside the facility had been framed by preparation, by expectation, by some level of anticipation that allowed me to meet it halfway. It was late in the shift, the kind of hour when fatigue settled in quietly, when even the most disciplined routines risked becoming automatic, and I was working through a standard series of extractions that no longer felt unfamiliar, though they never felt entirely safe. The scorpion in front of me was not from the containment wing, not one of the most dangerous species we housed, but it was still capable of harm. And that was a fact that applied to all of them regardless of classification. My grip was steady, my positioning correct, and for a moment, everything aligned with the practiced rhythm I had developed, but then something shifted, not in the scorpion, but in me, a slight lapse in attention that I could not immediately identify, only feel as a subtle disconnect between intention and execution. The electrode made contact at an angle just slightly off from optimal, and instead of the controlled response I expected, the scorpion reacted with a sudden, forceful movement, its tail snapping with a speed that bypassed my reflexes. The stinger struck the surface of my glove with a sharp, almost inaudible tap, and for a fraction of a second, time seemed to compress into that single point of contact, every other sensation falling away as I registered what had just happened. I pulled back instinctively, my heart rate surging, my mind racing ahead of confirmation, questioning whether the glove had held, whether the barrier between me and the venom had been sufficient. Doctor Holden was at my side almost immediately, his response precise and controlled, instructing me to remain still, to not escalate the situation with unnecessary movement, and together we assessed the glove, checking for any breach. The material showed a faint mark where the stinger had struck, but it had not penetrated. The protection holding exactly as it was designed to, and yet the knowledge of how close it had come lingered with a weight that was difficult to shake. The scorpion, still partially restrained, required careful repositioning, and with guidance, I managed to regain control, completing the extraction with a focus sharpened by the immediacy of what had just occurred. When it was done, I released it back into its enclosure with more care than ever, my movements deliberate, almost measured to the point of caution, and only then did I allow myself to step back fully from the station. The room continued its steady rhythm around me, other technicians working as if nothing had happened. Not out of indifference, but because moments like this, while serious, were not entirely uncommon in a place where risk was part of the environment. Doctor Holden studied me for a moment, not with concern, but with a kind of analytical interest, as if evaluating not the incident itself, but my response to it. "You felt it before it happened, didn't you?" he said, and it wasn't a question so much as a statement, and I realized that he was right, that there had been a subtle warning, a shift in focus that I had noticed but not acted on. I nodded, the admission quiet but significant, because it acknowledged something deeper than the mistake itself. It pointed to awareness that had been present but not fully engaged. "That's the difference," he continued, "between reacting to risk and managing it," and the distinction settled into my thoughts with a clarity that lingered long after the moment had passed. For the remainder of the shift, I worked with a heightened sense of attention, not driven by fear, but by a renewed understanding of how quickly control could falter, and how essential it was to recognize those early signals before they manifested into something more immediate. When the day finally ended, the memory of the stinger striking the glove replayed in my mind, not as a source of panic, but as a precise point of reference, a moment that marked a transition from theoretical risk to experienced reality. And as I left the facility, the fading light once again stretching across the landscape, I carried with me a deeper respect for the balance we maintained inside those walls, and for the discipline required to sustain it without compromise. In the days following the incident, nothing in the facility changed outwardly, the routines remained intact, the protocols unchanged, and yet my perception of everything had shifted in a way that was impossible to ignore, as if a layer of abstraction had been stripped away, leaving only the raw mechanics of risk and control. I found myself moving more deliberately, not slower, but with a heightened awareness that extended beyond my immediate task, taking in the positioning of others, the subtle movements of the scorpions before contact, even the ambient sounds that hinted at activity beyond my line of sight. Dr. Holden did not address the incident again directly, which at first felt like an omission. But over time I understood it as a form of trust, an expectation that I would internalize the lesson without needing it repeated. That morning, he reassigned me to a calibration role within the extraction chamber, a position that required me to oversee the consistency of stimulation devices across multiple stations, ensuring that each was delivering precise output, and while it lacked the immediacy of handling, it demanded a level of technical focus that carried its own form of pressure. The devices were sensitive, their settings finely tuned to accommodate different species, and even minor deviations could affect both the safety of the technician and the quality of the venom collected, making the task more critical than it initially appeared. As I moved from station to station, running diagnostics, adjusting parameters, and verifying outputs, I began to see the extraction process from a broader perspective, not as isolated actions, but as a coordinated system where each component influenced the others. At one station, I noticed a slight irregularity in the response curve of a device, something subtle enough to go unnoticed during routine operation, but distinct when examined closely, and when I recalibrated it, the difference in performance was immediate, the stimulation more controlled, the scorpion's reaction less erratic. It was a small correction, but it reinforced how easily minor inconsistencies could accumulate into larger risks. And how vigilance extended beyond the obvious moments of danger. Later in the shift, I was asked to assist with a training session for a new recruit, a role that felt unexpected given how recently I had been in that position myself, and as I demonstrated the basic handling techniques, I became acutely aware of how much my own approach had evolved in a short time. The recruit's movements mirrored my earlier hesitation, the slight delays, the uncertainty in grip, and I found myself emphasizing the importance of commitment, of aligning intention with action, not as abstract advice, but as something I had experienced firsthand. There was a moment when the recruit faltered, their grip slipping just enough to cause the scorpion to react defensively. And I stepped in quickly, stabilizing the situation with a practiced motion that felt almost instinctive, and afterward, I realized that I had acted without the conscious hesitation that once defined my responses. That realization was both reassuring and sobering, because it marked a shift from learning to application, from observation to responsibility, and it carried with it an implicit expectation to maintain that level of control consistently. As the day progressed, I transitioned back into direct extraction, and the work felt different again, not easier, but more integrated, as if the technical understanding and physical execution were beginning to align more seamlessly. Each movement carried intent. Each adjustment grounded in both experience and awareness, and while the risk remained ever present, it no longer felt like an external force to be managed, but an inherent part of the process to be navigated with precision. By the end of the shift, I felt a quiet confidence that was distinct from the earlier, more fragile sense of accomplishment, because it was rooted not in isolated successes, but in a growing consistency of approach. As I removed my gloves and prepared to leave, I paused once more by the enclosures, watching the scorpions in their controlled habitats, and I no longer saw them solely as sources of danger or value, but as integral elements of a system that required respect at every level. From the smallest adjustment in a device to the most delicate moment of contact, and I understood that the deeper I moved into this work, the more that understanding would define not just how I performed, but how I perceived the balance between control and uncertainty that shaped everything within those walls. Weeks passed with a steadiness that might have seemed uneventful from the outside, yet within the facility, that steadiness was the result of constant attention, countless small corrections, and an unspoken commitment shared by everyone who worked there to maintain a balance that could not be taken for granted. By then, I had settled into a role that carried more responsibility than I had anticipated when I first arrived, moving fluidly between extraction, calibration, and occasional oversight of less experienced technicians, and while the progression felt natural, it also came with an awareness that expectations had shifted accordingly. Dr. Holden began involving me in more detailed discussions about yield optimization and species-specific handling strategies. Conversations that moved beyond basic technique into the realm of refinement, where marginal improvements could have significant impact over time. One afternoon, he invited me into a smaller lab adjacent to the main chamber, a space dedicated to analysis rather than extraction, where collected venom samples were examined for purity and consistency before being prepared for distribution. The environment there was quieter, almost contemplative, the hum of equipment softer, the pace more measured, and as I observed the process, I began to appreciate another dimension of the work, one that extended beyond the immediate interaction with the scorpions. A technician explained how variations in extraction technique could subtly influence the composition of the venom, affecting its suitability for different research applications, and it became clear that precision was not just about safety or efficiency, but about preserving the integrity of something far more complex than its appearance suggested. As I reviewed the data from recent batches, I noticed patterns emerging, small fluctuations that correlated with specific conditions or handling approaches, and when I pointed them out, Dr. Holden regarded me with a look that carried a hint of approval, not overt, but enough to signal that I was beginning to see the work at a deeper level. Later that day, we returned to the containment wing, this time with the expectation that I would take a more active role under supervision. And while the memory of my earlier experience there remained vivid, it no longer felt distant or intimidating in the same way. The scorpion selected for the extraction was again one of the more potent species, its presence commanding attention even before any contact was made, and as I prepared, I felt a familiar tension settle in, not as a deterrent, but as a necessary alignment of focus. My movements were slower, more deliberate, each step considered before execution, and when I secured the tail, it was with a control that felt both firm and responsive, adapting to the subtle shifts in the scorpion's posture. The extraction required precise calibration, and as I applied the stimulation, I remained attuned to the smallest changes, adjusting in real time rather than reacting after the fact, and when the venom appeared, it did so cleanly, without the abrupt movements that had characterized my earlier attempts. Corvin observed from the side, his expression neutral but attentive, and when I completed the process and transferred the venom to its vial, there was a brief pause, a moment where the significance of what had just happened settled in. "You're beginning to anticipate rather than respond," he said, his voice low, and the statement carried more weight than any direct praise could have, because it marked a shift in how I was engaging with the work. As we left the containment wing, the experience lingered with a sense of quiet validation, not as an endpoint, but as an indication that the progression I had been working toward was taking shape in a tangible way. The remainder of the day unfolded with the same steady rhythm that had come to define the facility, but beneath that surface, I felt a growing clarity, a sense that the layers of complexity I had once struggled to grasp were becoming more coherent, more integrated into how I approached each task. When the shift ended, I didn't leave immediately, instead pausing once more in the observation area, watching the scorpions move within their enclosures, and for the first time, I felt not just respect or caution, but a kind of alignment with the environment, as if I had begun to understand my place within it, not as someone imposing control, but as someone working within a system that required both precision and restraint in equal measure. The final day of my initial contract arrived without ceremony, marked not by any visible change in the facility but by a quiet awareness that something had reached a point of completion, or perhaps transition, and as I walked through the familiar corridors one more time, I found myself noticing details that had once seemed insignificant: the faint hum of the ventilation systems, the precise alignment of the enclosures, the steady, almost imperceptible movements of the scorpions behind glass. What had once felt like an environment defined by risk now revealed itself as something more nuanced, a system sustained by discipline, attention, and an understanding that had taken time to develop. Dr. Holden met me near the entrance to the extraction chamber, his expression unchanged, yet there was a subtle acknowledgement in the way he greeted me, as if the absence of formality itself carried meaning. The day's work proceeded as it always did, each task unfolding with the same measured precision, yet there was a sense of clarity in my actions that I had not experienced before, a cohesion between thought and movement that made each step feel intentional rather than practiced. In the containment wing, I completed an extraction under minimal supervision, my hands steady, my awareness fully engaged, and when it was done, there was no surge of relief, no heightened emotion, only a quiet confirmation that I had reached a level of competence that once seemed distant. Corbin offered a brief nod, the kind that required no elaboration, and I understood it as both recognition and expectation, a signal that this level of performance was now the baseline, not the exception. Later, in the analysis lab, I reviewed the final set of samples I would process as part of this contract, their clarity and consistency reflecting not just the work of that day, but the accumulation of every adjustment, every correction, every moment of attention that had led to this point. Dr. Holden joined me there, standing beside the workstation as I completed the documentation, and for a moment, neither of us spoke, the silence carrying a sense of closure that words might have disrupted. When he did speak, it was not to offer congratulations, but to ask a simple question, whether I intended to continue, and I realized that the answer had been forming long before that moment, shaped by everything I had experienced within these walls. I told him that I would, not out of obligation or even ambition, but because the work had become something I understood in a way that felt difficult to leave behind. He nodded once, as if that was the only response required, and with that, the conversation ended, leaving the decision acknowledged but not dramatized. As the shift came to a close, I removed my gloves and set them aside, the familiar motion carrying a different weight now. Less about finishing a task and more about marking a point of continuity, because although this chapter of my time at the facility was ending, the work itself was not. Walking back through the corridor, I paused one last time at the observation panels, watching the scorpions in their enclosures, their movements unchanged, their presence constant, and I realized that while my perception of them had evolved, they had remained exactly what they always were, precise, adaptive, and indifferent to the human systems built around them. Outside, the light stretched across the landscape in the same way it had on my first day, the facility standing quietly against the horizon, neither welcoming nor forbidding. Simply existing as it always had, and as I stepped into that open space, I carried with me not just the experience of what I had learned, but an understanding that would continue to shape how I approached everything that followed, because in a place where control and uncertainty coexisted so closely, the true measure of progress was not in eliminating risk, but in learning how to engage with it without losing clarity. And that was something that extended far beyond the boundaries of the facility itself.